Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's GTCS webinar. Today's webinar is Transforming the Emotional Load, presented by Claire Lavelle, Managing Director of the Hive of Wellbeing, with Sharon Smith, Senior Education Officer at GTCS Scotland. I am Fraser Shand, and I work at GTCS as Digital Communications and Events Coordinator. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You're listening in using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You can submit questions by typing these into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. If there are any questions we don't get around to answering today, we plan to publish a Q&A on our website soon. You can also use the questions pane to raise any technical issues you have, and we will do the best we can to find a solution. Like many of you, we are adjusting to new technology and the perils of home internet connections, so please bear with us should we encounter any difficulties during the webinar tonight. Materials from tonight's webinar and a recording will be available on our Health and Wellbeing Hub by tomorrow afternoon. Just search Health and Wellbeing GTCS on Google to find the resource. I would now like to introduce Sharon Smith to introduce tonight's webinar.
Thank you, Fraser. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharon Smith and I am a Senior Education Officer within the Education team at the General Teaching Council Scotland. Thank you all very much for signing up to this webinar entitled Transforming the Emotional Load. As time in lockdown continues, we are very grateful to you to have you with us today, and we hope that you all find today's session useful and supportive. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Claire Lavelle, the Director of the Hive of Wellbeing, to begin today's seminar.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you very much, Fraser, as well, and the GTCS for having me here again. This time you can see me. I don't know if that's a blessing or not, but in the last webinar you could only hear me. But I'll try, as always, to present some useful coaching strategies and approaches to help you with transforming the emotional load just now. I want to thank the participants for joining us today. So whether you are parenting your own children today and supporting them with their learning from home, whether you have been working at a school hub today or working from home with online learning for your own classes, whether you've been doing outreach work today and volunteering and delivering meals to families within your community, thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day, out of your week, indeed, to focus on yourself and focus on your own well-being. As I said, I'm here to share some ideas from coaching approaches and strategies that I use to support well-being for the people whom I work with in schools right across Scotland. And today we're going to be looking at transforming the emotional load. That word transforming, transformational, it's a very powerful word. And I suppose what I'd like to do to start off with is to illustrate my direction of travel today with a story, as often is the case in a lot of my sessions. So this story is about two caterpillars, two talking caterpillars it seems. And these two caterpillars are out doing caterpillar things, chomping on their leaves, and they look up to the sky. And they both see a butterfly. And one caterpillar says to the other, "You wouldn't catch me in one of those, that's for sure." And it's a very poor joke to start off with, I understand, and it's maybe not good for your well-being, but it is to illustrate this. It's to illustrate the contrast in what it takes to transform. That in fact, we may feel uncomfortable at times carrying a specific emotional load with us just now. But in fact, those feelings that we have that are the negative feelings, that are the difficult feelings, there may also be a familiarity with those feelings. But there's also, in that transformation, the possibility to grow and the possibilities as to where those transformations might take us as well. So the main theme today is really going to be about stories that we tell ourselves and their emotional impact in our lives. And if we can change our stories, can we then change how we feel, particularly at this time during this crisis? So moving on to this next slide just now. Sorry, there we go. The stories we tell ourselves, are they resourceful for us or not? Expectations are an example of stories and attributions that we often make, often as well about ourselves. Yet how many of them are resourceful? I've taken this example of an expectation which I've been hearing from teachers in recent times about online learning and their expectation and feeling of pressure to get feedback to their pupils as soon as they possibly can. And when I speak to those teachers, I ask them about this expectation, this attribution that they're making about themselves. Is it useful? Is it helpful? Is it real? And does it have to be this way? Or is it something that individuals are creating for themselves? Because it may also be pointing to a deeper story or a deeper attribution that we make about ourselves, such as the link we perhaps make about, if I don't get feedback to pupils quite so soon, what will people think about me? Am I letting people down? Do people think that I'm good enough? And indeed, do I feel that for myself? So the way in which we make attributions around expectations and the stories that we tell ourselves perhaps point towards deeper stories we can get ourselves involved in, or that we tell ourselves. I've also noticed a story which I mentioned the last time in the webinar about being productive. I said in the last webinar how I'd met online a number of teachers who were berating themselves for not feeling productive just now, not feeling that they were doing enough. But I was also exploring with those particular individuals and other colleagues of mine, were you also berating yourselves before the lockdown about not being productive? I heard a perennial story, and it's one I told myself back in the day, of having my to-do list, going in with a plan for the day, getting to the end of the day, not having had my lunch or a cup of tea, and feeling that I was so busy, but actually what had I gotten done? What had I been productive with in that particular day? So there's something there about checking in with stories that we were telling before lockdown and stories that we might be telling ourselves now. And is there a thread? Is there a theme? Is there a recurrent pattern? One of the stories that I myself have used for myself, or that I've noticed in recent times, is that prior to lockdown, when I was going in to deliver a session in schools, there were some times when I'd be going into a session where a story, a long enduring story of mine would pop into my head. And it was this one. It's just as I was approaching the doors of the school, I'd think, oh, what if I don't know enough? What if I don't know enough in order to share the right things with people and they're looking for different information? Those kind of stories started to run through. When I noticed this before lockdown, I started to tell myself a new story. And the new story was, I'm going in here to provide what I can to support others in the best way that I can. I don't have all the answers, and I might not be everybody's cup of tea, but I am here to help and support, and I can point people towards other people who can help in the best way possible. So that story was much more resourceful for me, and it gave me the confidence I needed in order to deliver sessions and present sessions in the best way I possibly could. But I've noticed that since lockdown, and when the sessions, the physical sessions of going into schools were taken away, there was a little bit of a reprieve from that story. But since the Zoom sessions have started up, where I've been working with different schools on Zoom, that story has crept back in about what if I don't know enough, what if I can't give everyone what they're looking for. And I've had to revisit the new story that I have to keep practice telling myself, I'm here to provide as much as I possibly can to support others in the best way possible.
Well, it seems to me it's about self-talk, isn't it?
Yeah, very much. And it's about, I suppose, becoming conscious of the self-talk that is resourceful, and also being aware that there's some self-talk that isn't always helpful or isn't as useful. And that self-talk isn't necessarily defining who you are. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through the session. But yeah, it certainly is about the stories we tell ourselves, Sharon, absolutely, and how they make you feel. So I'm revisiting that strategy that I mentioned in the last webinar about noticing. And I suppose I just want to make the links, but I've got a lot of new material that I want to share with you today as well. But it's important to notice then the stories that we're telling ourselves. That's the first step, I would say, to our transformation or making changes to deal with that emotional load. I've got two very contrasting stories here. It's almost exaggerated, but it's to make a couple of points. The first point I'd like to make is we have to become aware of, is the story I have, is it my story or is it someone else's story? Is it a story that I have inherited from the past, or from someone or from a past experience. And Eric Berne, who was a psychotherapist dealing in transactional analysis, he talks about the voices of the past, and he talks about the child's voice. So sometimes even as an adult, we might say, that's not fair, that's not right. But in fact, it could be the child within us at times just crying out the injustice of a situation. Or it could be a parent's voice, you know, you've not to do that, I've been telling you not to do that. It could be a parent's voice or a caregiver's voice. And then there's the adult voice, which is the voice we want to have, which is able to integrate all of these experiences and the experiences we've had as adults in order to resource us with a story that's helpful to us. So the second point I'd like to make about the contrasting stories here is that these are the drivers. And although they're quite extreme, it's to make that point that we're often driven to respond to situations as a result of the habitual stories and beliefs we have consciously taken on, or unconsciously taken on. So those thoughts and stories are habits. And again, noticing is that kind of first step that we want to take in order to make those transformations. And habits feature a lot in the work of John Whitmore, and he was known for the GROW model. But what's not often talked about within his work is the inner game. And I want to just focus on this for a little bit just now. The quote he has here from his book, Coaching for Performance, he says, we have a measure of choice and control over what we are aware of, but what we are unaware of controls us. Now, that's quite challenging for us just now, because in fact, we are very aware of COVID-19 and its impact and the fact that it is controlling us. So we are very conscious of that. But I think what he means beyond that is that we can now control how its impacts on us and how we respond to the different measures. And when he talks about the inner game, he talks about this idea really of noticing, as I see it, so developing that awareness of self and of others, noticing what's resourceful for us, what matters to us. He also talks about responsibility, which for me is about making choices. So once I can notice how a situation is affecting me, how I feel, I can then make choices about what is resourceful in responding, making responses to that with my thoughts, my behaviours, my own actions. And then he talks about shedding the baggage. Now that's a point of real transformation, where he talks about changing the habits and beliefs, getting rid of those old beliefs and habits that have affected us for a long time. And I think, as I say, that's part of that transformation that we are aiming for in our lives. And I've got a question here about what old beliefs, fears, habits are resurfacing at this time. I just want to make this point, that at this time during lockdown, it is unprecedented what we're going through. We are perhaps spending an awful lot more time with our families or even on our own. And as a result of that, you may have experienced, and I've been speaking to colleagues about this, and I know this from one experience, you might be experiencing the resurfacing of old stuff, of old thoughts, of old habits, of old stories. If it's possible, and I know Sarah Philp, who's working with the GTC just now, she's written a blog about creating the space and time to just check in with what's happening for you just now. I think that's really worthwhile and really resourceful. So just considering that inner game can be really resourceful.
Claire, can I just ask, in the quote here, we have a measure of choice and control over what we are aware of, but what we are unaware of controls us. I see parallels there with the same as us being preoccupied by us not having the answers about what's next for us in school and what's next for us as far as governmental decisions. And that preoccupies quite a lot of our mind just now, doesn't it? It controls us.
Yes, you're right that it does control elements of our circumstances and our situation just now, but it doesn't have to control all parts of who we are. And I think there's something there about where is our focus and what's going to energise us and support us. So by putting our focus on what we can control in our immediate vicinity is powerful, is important. We need to keep our focus on that. And I think focusing on moment to moment can also be a way of taking back control, as opposed to living in an uncertain future. And I think, as I think I'd mentioned before in the last webinar, that practice of acceptance, that in fact, this is what we have to accept for now. And I think what's interesting when we do look at the news just now, there is a sense that lockdown is shifting. Now in Scotland, clearly, the stay-at-home message is very clear, but there's also a sense now that we can go out for exercise more than once a day. So there's a sense that we are shifting, and therefore that practice of acceptance that this is what we have for now is a good acknowledgement of it's going to shift, but this is where we are in this moment. So yeah, no, great question. Thank you very much. Brilliant. So I know some of you will be listening in just now, watching this and thinking, that's all very well, Claire, but what is my story? How do I notice my story, and how do I know what that recurrent story is? And I want to share this example with you. A good way of finding out what your story is noticing your own self-talk and noticing what you are telling yourself. And those of you who have children, noticing perhaps what you're telling your children. Maybe some messages from yesteryear are hitting home. I speak to a lot of parents who say, oh, I'm never going to say that to my children, and then find themselves doing exactly that thing. So I think, again, back to that idea of noticing what we're saying to ourselves, what we're saying to our children, and if we don't have children, what we're saying to our children in class at times when we have them in our classrooms. But there's also something here about our neuroplasticity, that in fact when we practice a certain kind of self-talk, we have neurons that are firing together, and therefore according to the Hebbian law they are wiring together. So if we're thinking the same thoughts time and time again, it's strengthening those neural connections, and if you like, you're becoming what you focus on, and you start then running a very strengthened program of self-talk, which if unchecked and unconscious can lead to very unresourceful places in our lives. I want to share my own experience of a very unresourceful place, and I want to apologise in advance for any PE teachers out there or any primary practitioners who love PE. My apologies, it's got a happy ending, that's for sure. But when I was in primary school, I used to love PE and I used to love ball games. Anything with a ball, I was there, I was great at it. Not so much when it came to gymnastics or cross-country running. And I remember a particular time in gymnastics where I was seemingly very unflexible, not quite sure what the adjective is, and certainly nothing's changed since then regarding my flexibility. But I remember getting a comment, a kind of negative comment from my PE teacher. And I also just say at this point, every other PE teacher I've had has been astonishingly marvellous. So maybe she was just having a bad day, old Mrs. Jones. I do apologise to her now. But that had an impact on my experience of PE. And as I went into secondary school, I didn't really enjoy it as much. Gymnastics in first year was the very first thing that we had to do. And I was haunted by this message. And I would tell people, I'm always getting this wrong, I'm useless at this. And it affected other parts of PE, and then I didn't elect to do PE. And even in my young adult life, I just had this story running about, I'm no good at sports. And then when I became a teacher, I realised I needed to level up and I needed to find new ways, because I needed to teach PE and I didn't want the children to have any poor experience of it. So in researching it more, in pushing myself a bit more to develop more strategies regarding PE, I noticed that the children enjoyed it. And if the children enjoyed it, then I started to really enjoy it. And therefore I started to tell myself a new story. And therefore I started to create new neural pathways to reset the old unhelpful messages. I created a new self-talk, which if I practiced and made some effort, I could improve. And since then, I've taken up a bit of running for myself. I've engaged in sports as an adult, which I might never have done if I hadn't had this experience of teaching PE. I also want to make the point here that it works both ways. It's not just about our thoughts and changing our thoughts and our feelings, which then create new behaviours. Sometimes it can be a shift in our behaviour, which then changes our thoughts and our feelings, and being open to those new experiences can allow us to shift our perspectives in our lives. So,
Claire, can I say, I see that as, we hear it a lot just now about maybe meditation helping us with our anxieties, or visualizations, or affirmations, and that again is all about using power words to create that self-talk in your head to change that story almost, isn't it?
Yeah, very much. And And it is about imagining our possibilities. The thing about self-talk, if it's negative, it limits our potential, as I showed in my own experience. But in saying yes and having more positive self-talk and imagining our possibilities, then we can do things differently. And if we stay with the PE example, and if we level up a bit to top athletes, you know, Djokovic puts a lot of his success now, or his continued success, down to mindfulness. He's practicing much more mindfulness. And I think the swimmer, was it Adam Petrie? He had brought in a lot more visualization into his practice to beat a specific British record in swimming. So we don't have to be athletes. Again, I proved that as well. But in taking some of those examples, we can apply it to our own lives and consider those possibilities and what we can become, or who we can become. I also want to stay with that idea of, well, you know, strategy that would support me to change my self-talk and to do things a bit differently, to change our stories. And the world-renowned coach, Tony Robbins, uses this technique, which is the belief table. And what he talks about is that we are running scripts or programs which are running our lives quite unconsciously and limiting our potential. So during this time where we're looking to transform our emotional load during this kind of lockdown time, there may be opportunities to consider those stories which are now less resourceful for us in managing our emotions day to day during this time. And that's why I've taken an example of teaching online. This might not be relevant any longer for people who over the last 6 weeks, I've taken the 2 weeks out of the holidays there, but over the last 6 weeks or so, have been coming to terms with this and grappling with this. We're all pros now, I'm sure. But it may have been resonant in the first couple of weeks of this, particularly when we didn't feel confident with some of our IT skills, perhaps. So what Tony Robbins would say is you put that limiting belief on the top of the table. And then what you do is you look at what are the other thoughts that you're having around this that hold up in some way that tabletop belief. So what's holding this particular one up? So some things that I've heard from people are things like, well, my other colleagues are much better at this than me. And what we do is we take each of those legs, if you like, and we challenge them. We probe a little deeper and we question it to say, well, is it real? Is that true? And what does that mean? So maybe others are always going to be much better than me at IT and doing things online. However, this is the class I have, these are the pupils I have, and therefore what can I provide? And what am I learning each day to support me with this and to make things better for my experience and for theirs? The other leg here, I can't get the IT to work when I need it. Well, as we know from the last webinar, Sharon, you couldn't see me, we couldn't see each other, but we still had the webinar. So there's something about how do we use the IT in the best way that we can, and what's the kind of contingency plan when that can't happen. This one as well, I'm getting so little feedback from my pupils. Well, I would question that and say, well, is that a reflection on you as a teacher, or is it a reflection on the circumstances your pupils are facing at home? And lastly, I'm just not technologically minded. No, I understand that, and that might be a story that we tell ourselves too. But where have you made progress? What have you tried out that you would never have even ventured to do prior to this lockdown? And so what he would say is then we've got to find ways to, we recognise then that these legs might be illusory. They're just illusions. And therefore, what is more real? And we take that belief and we flip it. And I might take a belief now that it's not about me being no good at teaching online, but it's about I am making good progress with my online learning with my pupils. And then we can look at the legs and provide solid evidence as to where that progress is being made. So that's one strategy. And it ties in nicely with this idea of changing our perspective and changing that emotional load. Because we can start to look at the possibilities of who we can become if we can start to change some of the stories that we tell ourselves in a much more resourceful way. And Richard Boyatzis, and again, all through my sessions, I'm always talking about people I've been reading about because I want to signpost different writers and different coaches so that other people can make these observations for themselves and do their own research. But Richard Boyatzis wrote Resonant Leadership. I think that was back in 2009, 2010. But last year he wrote a book called Helping People Change. And he's a huge proponent of an approach called coaching with compassion. And in the approach he takes, he talks about becoming your ideal self. What would it take for you to become your ideal self? Knowing who you are as your real self just now. But we've got to do it in a way that is filled with compassion for ourselves, and focus on feeling who we want to become. And in the model that he talks about in Helping People Change, he talks about this idea of there being positive emotional attractors in our lives and negative emotional attractors in our lives. And the way that I paraphrase it is, in my own simple way, is you want it more than you don't want it. So what do you want more of that's going to support you in achieving or becoming more of your ideal self? What's lovely about his model as well is there's a flexibility within that. It's not about setting goals, it's about setting intentions. So if we intend to go in a specific direction, we might veer off and take a new direction, but it's got us to that place, and there's real compassion with that. We have an exercise here which the participants who've joined us today, I'd invite you, if you have pen and paper with you, to try out this exercise. I'm going to talk you through this and allow you some time to try this out. This is a simplified version of the more complex model that Boyatzis presents in his book. But I want to take you through this exercise just now. Very simply, it's called the 2 circles exercise. And what it consists of are the 2 circles, funnily enough. But what I would ask you to do just now, if you're able to take a blank piece of paper, is on that blank piece of paper, I'd ask you to draw a circle that represents where you are now with your emotional load. Where you are now, and it might have been before this webinar, how have you been feeling? And also draw that circle. And once you've drawn that circle, write down some thoughts, some words pertaining to what has your story been to make you feel this way, and how have you been feeling? And where do you feel that you've been getting stuck? So I'm just going to give you a moment now, or a minute, just in silence, to write down some of those words, some of those phrases around that first circle. Where are you now? Now, as it is the 2 circles exercise, you know what's coming in, you can see the screen, I know. The second circle I would like you to draw, please, is to represent your ideal self, if you like, or indeed at least your new possibilities. So drawing a circle that represents that, and then again writing down, drawing some pictures even as well, that is helpful, and writing down some words about your new possibilities. How do you want to feel after this webinar, or into next week, or towards June, or even into the summer holidays, even up to August? What is it you want to feel? What are your new possibilities? What are the stories you could start telling yourself? And then what would you want to do about this? And again, I'll give you a minute to do this. And then looking at the space between those circles, thinking about those steps, and what kind of steps or intentions could you now make for yourself, and what do you need, and what's a kind of new story that might be occurring to you, or at least a new awareness that's even developing through doing part of this exercise. You just want to write down some thoughts around that.
Claire, this reminds me of a coaching experience I had way back many years ago when I first had my first principal teacher post, and it was almost like a walkthrough that I had a really challenging conversation to have, So I started off with talking about how I was feeling about it, and then I physically walked beyond that meeting, and I had had a really positive meeting and it had gone the way I had planned it, and actually had to look back and identify the things I needed to do to make me have that outcome. So it's really on a similar sort of line as that. It's very similar, and it's really useful exercise to do.
It is, and I've used this on a number of different themes, different topics. So it's not just about our emotions, although that's what we're focusing perhaps on today, but it is thinking about, as you say, developing my confidence, going for interviews, or it could be about, as you say, there's challenging conversations, or indeed it could be about your financial situation. That's always helpful. Sometimes we can get stuck in our heads and stuck in that story.
It's you finding that solution for yourself though, which is the most empowering thing about it.
That's it. And as we wind up this kind of exercise, and on the back of what you're saying just now, it's more about the process of this exercise that is helpful, because it perhaps has allowed us to shift a little, and just a little shift can make a huge difference to how we're feeling about our circumstances, as opposed to ruminating around our heads. So that's one technique. But as we all know, transformation is hard. Making those changes, carrying out the actions needed to make the changes, it can be really tough. And it does take practice to build those new habits. So anyone who's ever dieted hundreds of times, anyone who's ever tried to give up alcohol for a number of months, or smoking for good, it's really difficult to build those new habits. And a book by Dr. Joe Dispenza, he talks about breaking the habit of being yourself, which is quite a harsh title, but there's real merit in the literalness of that title, in that he talks about us being plugged into the past, that our brain has gathered all of the information from our experiences and our responses, and now it uses it to respond to what we are facing now. And he talks in his book about we can get stuck in ruts with particular habits, and these clouds represent some of the habits and some of the situations that I have spoken to with coachees before, in some of their circumstances they've maybe faced in school. And I also say as well that, for example, routines are not bad in themselves. Routines are very useful. It's when routines become the master of us and not the servant for us that it becomes a bit of an issue, for example. So there are different things here. They're not good or bad, but it's just how we use them. But there are maybe some other aspects here which are quite challenging for us. He talks about the fact that it takes 17 seconds for new thoughts to wire together. So in our brain, 17 seconds for the neurons to fire, great. But for the new thought to stay and to stick and to become a habit, it can take up to 21 days. And therefore, the adage he uses is practice, 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 which is so important. But he says it's not enough to just know that's what you want. You've got to feel that's what you want. And I think in reference to the athletes I was speaking about before, they have to really want that success. They have to really feel the success, and they have to feel the feeling that it is to win and become winners. And that's what incentivizes them a lot from things that I've looked at and read. So in a particular example, let's take learned helplessness as one of the clouds. Let's take that as an example. If I have got myself into self-talk and into a habit of going to a place of just learned helplessness, I might want to decide that from now on, a new thought is, I'm going to feel more control in my life, regardless of the external situation. Internally, I'm going to feel that control, or I'm going to feel, in addition to that, that acceptance. Because there are things in life that are very difficult for us sometimes to just let go of, and I appreciate that. So developing greater control, coupled with acceptance, that's perhaps a new habit of mine. And what he talks about then in the book is about creating new patterns, not just in our minds, but also in our bodies. We've got to feel it. We've got to feel where we have control and acceptance in our lives. And we've got to practice, practice, practice. And this is just an example just now of a cycle of what that might look like, some strategies to help us bring notice into a cycle, noticing into a cycle where it is of greater resourcefulness for us. Now, we're going to move to have a light-hearted poll, as I understand it just now. I know the GTCS, you love a poll during the webinar, but I've come up with a poll this time with a bit of a difference, and it's quite light-hearted on habits. So Sharon, I'm going to hand over to you just now to go to that poll, and to Fraser as well, to go to that poll and let the voting begin.
Okay, I've just launched the poll now, so people are free to answer now. I'll give you about a minute to do so.
Also a good time to invite people to ask Claire any questions. If you wish to do so, you can do that through the question pane.
Okay, I'm just going to close that poll now and share the answers. So the habitual behaviour that people are noticing the most is being constantly distracted from immediate tasks, with 36%. 28% are checking the news or social media. 19% grazing for snacks more often than before. 17% looking more often at their smartphone out with school hours, and a surprising 0% perfecting their TikTok dances or lip syncing. We need to get some more creative teachers on the go, apparently. I'll just hide that now.
Thank you. So forgive me for my lightheartedness, and I'm delighted that no one's engaging in the TikTok dance, especially that blinding lights one. Yeah, I've not mastered that myself either. But it's lighthearted to make a serious point. And a couple of serious points, how new habits may be forming, and what are the conditions for new habits forming, and noticing and being mindful and aware of what the conditions are for when new habits start to take place, but also the pre-existing habits may be intensifying. And an example of that for myself just now is that there are times when I'm checking my smartphone, and those checks have intensified over the last number of weeks. So I've become much more mindful of that, and therefore mindful about the behaviours I want to see in myself, whereby I put the phone in another room before I go to bed late at night. It's not the first thing I then turn to in the morning. So just recognising there are certain behaviours that will prevent me from engaging in some of these habits that are unhelpful. So the one where we're feeling distracted from those immediate tasks, maybe taking some time out, just 2 minutes out, to be mindful, to pause and to look in your vicinity and focus on 3 things you can see, 3 things you can hear, 3 things you can taste or smell, 3 things that you may be feeling. And then bring yourself back to the task you have to do, and creating the physical circumstances where perhaps you will not allow yourself to be distracted. And if that's very difficult to do because we're looking after children, it may be that there are chunks of time in the day where it is quieter for you to focus on the task you need to at that particular time. So I can follow up with any of this if there are any further questions and more time. As I did before, I'm very happy for anyone to contact me, to get in touch, goes to the poll there, to get in touch for a 20-minute, 30-minute call to me for free at any time you want to discuss any of this. Very happy to do that. I want us to take us then to not the TikTok dances, a much more serious habit, and perhaps an enduring habit for some, which is worry. Or it could be you could replace the worry habit with the anger habit, with the distracted habit. You could replace this with an emotion that's perhaps happening for you just now. But there might be an element of this habit which has been lifelong. And let's take the worry habit just now as an example. But trying to suppress this we will find that it comes back an awful lot stronger. It's like that whole idea of, don't think of a pink elephant. And of course, the pink elephant is the first thing that pops into your head. So instead of suppressing the feeling, it's about taking time to acknowledge the benefits of why we worry in the first place. It's about befriending worry, because worry comes and visits us when perhaps we need to feel safe. It is alerting us to the fact that we might not always feel so safe. So it's got a job to do, but it's recognising the limits on that job and how successful it is, and then to switch off from that. I want to share a technique to support you with that. So some of the examples I've got down here about redirection, from meditation, mindfulness, these are great practices. But there is something that I have found to be very helpful as a technique, and there's an associated material with this that will be available to you tomorrow afternoon on the GTCS website. And it's the narrative therapy approach. Now, the narrative therapy approach was developed in the 1970s and the 1980s by Michael White and David Epstein. Michael White's from Australia, David Epstein's from New Zealand, and they developed the narrative therapy approach. And it's this idea that we are bound up with our own narratives, our own stories in our lives. And what they talk about is externalizing those stories and externalizing the problems. We are not the problems. We are not just born worriers. We are not just learned helpless people. But in fact, these are problems that visit us. And that idea of the worries visiting us, or the worried thoughts arriving, is very similar to this example I want to take you through just now. And I myself have suffered from anxiety, quite severe anxiety at times throughout my life. And for a while, I just thought, I'm just an anxious person. I just can't cope sometimes with certain things. And then I came across this, and it's been really supportive and helpful in getting some perspective for me in my life, and supporting me to externalize the anxiety, see it as a visitor in my life, but not becoming the anxious person. So what they say here is, if when you internalize it and it becomes about part of your identity, which isn't helpful, you might ask the question, or someone might ask you the question, how long have you been anxious? Whereas in fact, asking the external question, when did anxiety first come into your life? That means that I wasn't always anxious. That means that, yeah, it did come into my life at some point. And when I was asked that question, it gave me a whole new mindset on what this anxiety was. You could use this for anger. How long have you been angry? Well, in fact, when did anger first come into your life? And what you start to recognize is that anger, anxiety, worry, a whole host of emotions, which we can sometimes think are negative, are actually coming into our lives to protect us, to support us in some way. But we perhaps make it too much of a habitual response for it then to become unresourceful. So one of the techniques that they use, which I found very helpful, is to find a metaphor or a persona which allows you to relate to this problem in an external way. I'd like to introduce you to someone just now, and I'd like to introduce you to Henriette. My apologies to anybody out there called Henriette. I don't know any Henriettas, and this was a name that just came to me, so my apologies. But this is Henriette, and she is wonderfully efficient. But she visits me, and she is my personification of anxiety. She is very well dressed, very smartly dressed, and she turns up when I am overwhelmed, when I'm feeling out of control, and when I have that feeling of anxiety visiting me. She turns up with a clipboard, and she very unhelpfully tells me what it is I've not done and what it is I need to get done. And this narrative therapy approach has helped me to write down, or to write to Henriette, or just write down some things to say to her, to say things like, it's okay, I've got this under control. Sometimes when Henriette visits, I go to my desk and I rewrite a to-do list that I feel I'm in control of and is realistic. And for the rest of the stuff, I say to Henriette, this is all that we can physically do tomorrow. Come back tomorrow if you need to see if we have to have this conversation again. So it sounds a little daft, but it's actually been really helpful in me managing the anxiety being separate from me. So
Claire, that reminds me of Dr. Carol Dweck in her book Mindset. She talks about her external character, Maurice, who she blames for everything her husband does wrong. She said she's a self-confessed blamer, and it helps her with her anger regarding that. So very similar.
So, yeah, plenty of Maurices appearing in households tonight then, Sharon. Yeah, thank you for that reminder from Carol Dweck. Good to know. But that idea of using imagery or using a person, using that persona, can be very helpful. And I want to share this other way to transform those emotional experiences. And NLP, so neuro-linguistic programming, and that approach can be used to retrain the mind and also retrain the body, because we feel those thoughts in our bodies in new ways, and to feel differently about our circumstances. And those of you who are interested in NLP, there is one of the kind of big proponents of this is Richard Bandler, and he's written copious amounts of books on this, and he has videos on this. And he also worked alongside Paul McKenna, you know, that kind of celebrity hypnotist. So please don't worry, you won't be hypnotized by anything in the webinar today. But they refer to this idea of the theatre of the mind. And I think that's a very helpful way, again, to separate who I am from the thoughts that I'm having or the experiences that I'm having within my mind. And what I would ask you to do just now is just engage with this exercise if you're comfortable to do so. But if you could imagine yourself walking into a cinema theatre, choosing a seat on your own, and there's no one else in that cinema, no one else coming in at the back of you. That door is now safe and shut. And if you could think of replaying an experience on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being really mild and 10 being, you know, quite severe, I'd ask you to think about somewhere in the range of 3, kind of mild to the less moderate experience, but a kind of experience where it might have caused you some discomfort, some sort of emotional experience that might have caused you discomfort. And you might have created either the metaphor for this, if it's anxiety, if it's an enduring thing, or it might be the actual experience itself of a situation. And what happens in NLP is that we would normally ask you to close your eyes, but you're very happy for you just to watch and to look at the slide just now. But we would talk you through the experience of bringing that situation onto the screen. But this is a screen that you have full control over, and you have the remote control. So the first thing we would ask is, you know, what does it look like? What does this experience look like? And what can you change about its appearance, rather, so that you have control? Is it a moving image or a still image? Is it in colour or is it in black and white? Is it surrounded by a frame or is it open? You have control over this, and you can change the image with your remote in any way you wish. It's a very fancy remote. And then what does it sound like? What does that experience sound like? And what can you change about its sound so you have control? Do you want to turn the volume down, or do you want to make it really loud? So you can't hear the words. It's better for you to do that. Or is it good just to make it a silent movie and to turn it down completely? And what about the tone? What do you want to change about that? So it's soft or harsh, or what is best for you? And also recognizing how it makes you feel. And what can you change about this? You've got a different perspective on it now. You were involved in it, but now as an observer, what occurs to you now about what is happening on screen? Do you want to reduce the size of this experience, push it away into the corner? Do you want to use the remote just to switch it off and then leave it in the theatre as you visualise walking away and locking the door? So this slide is going to be available tomorrow, and if it's one you think, yeah, that resonates with me, it's something that you can practice yourself by just taking yourself through that process. And the last offering that I have for today in the next few slides is bringing the kind of ideas together. But this is a very powerful and transformative approach to dealing with relationships. I appreciate that some of you might have brought to mind in that last slide a relationship issue, as opposed to just an emotion issue regarding yourself or a story you're telling yourself. I want to share this story with you now. Now, I get no commission on the people I talk about or the books I promote and all, but I found this of great worth and of great value, and it's a book written by David Emerald, called The Power of Ted. And it's a fable, and it's a story of David, the author, meeting this gentleman randomly called Ted. And Ted teaches David, or speaks to David, about the way we talk about our lives and experiences will show up in our day-to-day experiences. And I'm going to take you through some of that work on Ted. The first thing that Ted speaks to David about is something called your Frisbee, not your Frisbee. That's a different book. So your Frisbee is this. So he talks about, what are you focused on in this moment? So what you focused on in this moment, and then what is your inner state? So what emotions is my focus then taking me to? And then what are my resulting behaviours as a result of that inner state? And he shows David that if he changes his focus, very quickly his inner state can change. Now, in Zoom sessions I've been having with teachers in the last few weeks, we've been talking about where we are so distracted, we can't concentrate. And teachers have been talking about the fact that, well, they just went for a walk, they came back, and what they thought was a task that was so onerous is no longer that onerous, because the focus has changed and their inner state has changed. So again, for me, it's another version of noticing, of making choices, and of shedding the baggage, back to that inner game. So what is TED? Well, in order to understand TED, we need to know it, or understand or know about its opposite number, called the dreaded drama triangle. And Stephen Karpman in the 1960s, 1968, he came up with the dreaded drama triangle based on transactional analysis. He worked closely with Eric Berne, who I mentioned before. And in his work, he talks about the fact that sometimes in relationships, we can play a role. And when we're feeling anxiety, sometimes when we're feeling anger, we can go to a place of feeling like, poor me, I'm the victim. That's the kind of mantra that the victim would feel, poor me. If there was we look for a rescuer, and sometimes people are only too happy to rescue us, because it allows them to deflect from their own issues and focus on us, and they like keeping us as the victim. It's really helpful for them. Their mantra will be, I'll save you. And then there's the persecutor. And their mantra would be, oh, it's all your fault. The persecutor is perceived as being quite rigid and authoritarian. It's fueled by anxiety, and it's very much focused on the problem. Whereas what David Emerald does is he takes the victim and says, actually, you can become a creator. So instead of focusing on the problem and being fueled by anxiety, what's your passion? What's your mission? What's your purpose? And who are you becoming? Back to that 2 circles exercise. Who are you becoming? Focus on those outcomes and go in that direction. When I then become a creator within my circumstances, I no longer have a persecutor, but I have a challenger. A challenger's there to help me to learn and to grow. The coach is there, not as a rescuer, I'm not dependent on this person, but they're there to show up, kind of mirror of reality. So there are questions there. Again, these will be on the slides. It's an exercise for you to think about, and it's certainly something that I know has resonated with a number of people. Yeah.
It certainly helps us when we're thinking about our teacher identity as well, Claire.
Mm-hmm.
And who we are, and maybe when we go back to school, what will that look like? How will I be? Am I going to be someone who is the the victim? Yes. Or will there be a persecutor, or am I actually going to create the new future and welcome challenges from others and coaching as well?
Yes, very much. We can get very stuck in our circumstances at times, in those relationships, and playing out those roles. So again, focusing on our passion, focusing on those outcomes, very important, but also recognising where we have fallen into those different roles. And a good example from my own experience as a head teacher was that there were times where I saw myself as a rescuer. So staff would come to me and say, oh, this has happened, Claire, what are we going to do? Don't worry, I'll sort it, would be my kind of response. But in doing so, I was disempowering staff, and perhaps they could then perceive me as a persecutor, because in disempowering them, I was doing it my way, and they might have felt, well, if I don't live up to that standard, or I don't do it that way, am I getting it wrong? And what is she looking for? And her expectations aren't clear, which would then lead me into a place of feeling like a victim sometimes. Poor me, no matter what I say, I can't get it right. But in fact, we were just playing out these different roles. So it can switch, it can flip quite a bit. And I know sometimes just now people can feel that even with their communications are getting, perhaps from some parents, from some others, they might feel they're being persecuted, but it's maybe just the tone in emails sometimes. So really think about challenge and growth and learning. So yeah, and you know, just these kind of questions, and again tying in with what Sarah Philp is saying, this last question I think is important. You know, how are you going to ensure that you're creating space and time to reflect on your own personal emotional journey, and where you can recognise that insights, shifts and transformations that are already taking place. So yeah, no, thanks for your time today, and thanks for giving me this platform to speak to so many participants, and thanks to the participants for taking time out and listening to me today. Well, that's been helpful.
Thank you very much, Claire. Now we'll move very quickly on to the Q&A. We've got 5 minutes left. There are actually a number of comments for, oh, the dog's just joined me. So a number of comments that I'll share with you that are just asides of today's presentation. But first of all, I would like to ask you a question from Kelly. And she says, what if I try out these techniques and I don't find that they work for me?
Yeah. Well, so yeah, no, it's a good question. Thanks, Kelly. So there's something there about these techniques aren't going to be overnight successes. And the couple of things I would say is that these are going to take practice. So I would choose one that resonates most with you and practice with that. The second thing I would do, it's a bit like the Joe Wicks workouts, where you're trying to make the quick gains. Burpees are not great for me, but running on the spot, that feels I'm doing cardio. So practicing noticing is a quick gain. Deep breaths, practicing that when I'm feeling anxious or out of control. And that narrative approach I think is good as well. And also recognising that techniques might not work because perhaps it's more of a therapeutic intervention that's needed. And therefore, I know that you're working with Paul Mills and other partners who have more practice in therapy. And the coaching I do is not a therapeutic intervention, so maybe there's help needed there. And there are numbers. Oh gosh, we'll put the numbers up just now for that. Thanks.
Great. And one very quick final question, but actually a very important one.
Yes.
Claire, really enjoyed the session. Who supports the leaders to stop them feeling overwhelmed whilst focusing on supporting their colleagues?
Great question. I think a couple of things there. The thing about leaders, and having been one, it is about establishing your own network, your own supportive network, and the people who've got you. Not always the case that it happens in your natural cluster or associated school group. Might be out with that. I know that there are some platforms on Twitter and Facebook to help with some of this. I'm also available if that person wants to contact me, and I can speak at more length because I'm conscious of time. But I also think in looking at that empowerment dynamic, there might be some stories that we are telling ourselves with some of that, so checking in with that. And the last thing I would maybe say is about our own boundaries, that in fact, looking at that empowerment dynamic and rescuing, are we coming into that rescuer role because we can't do all ourselves and we can't do all as sole leaders. We have to find ways to collaborate to work towards that. But excellent question. There's more to explore with that, I'm sure, with that individual. So if that individual wants to get in touch, please do give me a call, and certainly I'll give you that 20 minutes, 30 minutes absolutely free just to chat away through things.
Perfect. So for those people whose questions haven't been answered, we will pull together a Q&A for the website, and Claire will answer your questions for you then. Can I take this opportunity to thank you all? Thank you very much, Claire, for the work that you've done for us and for sharing today, and thanks to all attendees. Fraser, can I pass over to you, please?
Certainly. Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Claire, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If you do have any other questions, please contact communications@gtcs.org.uk. That's communications@gtcs.org.uk. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you'd complete that and provide your feedback. As I mentioned previously, the materials from today's webinar will be available on our website by tomorrow afternoon. On behalf of GTC Scotland, Claire, Sharon and myself, thank you for joining us today, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.